The convoy of medical and supply ships moved through the silent black of space, its engines glowing softly against the endless stars. The lead ship, a large freighter named Horizon, carried the most important cargo, containers filled with medicine, food, clean water, and wounded survivors from the last battle. These supplies and people were needed desperately on the colony world of Haven 3. The colony had been struggling for weeks after repeated raids, and this convoy was their only hope. The fleet was not made for battle. Most ships were slow freighters and hospital transports, escorted only by two small defense frigates. Their shields were thin, their weapons light, and their mission was mercy, not war. Still, everyone aboard knew the danger of traveling through space at a time when enemies lurked unseen. Captain Laura Bennett stood on the bridge of the Horizon, her eyes scanning the endless black ahead. She was calm but focused, a leader known for her clear mind under pressure. Her crew trusted her completely, even in moments of fear. At her side was Jack Turner, a young engineer who had already proven himself capable far beyond his years. Jack was not a soldier. He was a mechanic, a problem solver, a man who kept engines alive when others would give up. Yet, on this journey, even engineers felt the tension, because everyone knew the convoy was a tempting target. The comms buzzed softly with small talk between ships. Doctors on the hospital vessel Mercy were singing quietly to wounded children to calm them down. On another freighter, workers shared stories of Earth, talking about green forests and blue oceans, things many colonists had never seen. For a moment, space seemed peaceful. The ships floated forward, unaware that in the shadows of a dead moon, hostile eyes were watching. Then it began. The calm silence shattered when the Horizon's sensors screamed to life. Red alarms flashed across every console. "Contacts detected," shouted the sensor officer. "Multiple signatures, closing fast." The bridge grew cold. Captain Bennett's hand tightened on the railing as she stared at the screens. Out of the void came shapes, sleek, angular warships sliding from the darkness like predators. Their weapons glowed with power, shields already raised. They were not here to talk. They were here to kill. "Evasive maneuvers. Full burn." Laura ordered at once, her voice sharp but steady. Engines roared, but the freighters were heavy and slow. The two frigates moved to shield them, but it was like two guard dogs facing down a pack of wolves. The hostile fleet moved with deadly speed, fanning out to cut off escape. Jack Turner's hands flew across the engineering controls, rerouting power to the engines. "Captain, I can give you 20% more thrust, but the cores will overheat," he shouted. Laura didn't hesitate. "Do it." The convoy lurched forward, engines screaming as they pushed beyond safe limits. For a heartbeat, hope flickered. They might outrun the enemy. But it was too late. Without warning, the enemy opened fire. Brilliant lances of energy cut through the darkness, slamming into the lead medical ship. The hull erupted in flame and shrapnel, entire decks blown apart in an instant. The comm channels filled with screams, doctors, nurses, children, all crying out as their vessel burned. On the Horizon's bridge, the crew listened in horror. There was no time to save them. The medical ship was gone, its lights vanishing into the void as it broke apart. The enemy didn't stop. They poured fire into the convoy, targeting the weakest ships first. Another freighter's engines exploded, sending it spinning helplessly before shattering into debris. The frigates fought bravely, returning fire with their smaller cannons, but their shots barely scratched the enemy's shields. The attackers were merciless, efficient, and cold. On the Horizon, Jack worked desperately to keep the engines alive. Sparks flew around him as circuits overloaded and panels burst open. "We're losing power in the port thrusters," he yelled. "Reroute from life support if you have to," Laura commanded, her voice hard but unshaken. She knew every second of speed meant more lives saved. Around them, the void burned with destruction. Dr. Claire Morgan, stationed on another ship, rushed through smoke-filled corridors, dragging wounded crew into makeshift med bays. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to keep moving, to keep healing. She could hear the tearing sound of metal as hull plates were ripped apart. She knew their chances were slim, but she refused to give up. Back on the Horizon's bridge, the comms were still alive, but the voices were breaking one by one. "We've lost shields," a captain cried before his ship was reduced to silence. Another begged for help before being cut off mid-sentence. Each lost voice stabbed at Laura's heart. But she didn't allow herself to falter. She stared at the forward screen, jaw clenched, eyes burning with rage. The last of the medical transports was hit, its engines destroyed. Fire spread across its hull, and the ship drifted helplessly, a burning coffin in space. The screams on the comms faded into static. Only 3 ships remained intact now, fighting to escape. Laura's freighter, 1 damaged frigate, and a supply vessel limped away at maximum thrust. Behind them, the enemy slowed, watching their prey flee, perhaps satisfied with the destruction they had caused. As the survivors fled into the void, silence fell again, broken only by the sound of alarms and the labored breathing of those still alive. Laura gripped the console so tightly her knuckles turned white. "They fired on the wounded," she whispered, her voice low with fury. Jack, covered in sweat and smoke, looked at her with wide eyes. "Captain, what do we do now?" Her answer was cold and certain. "We survive. We take this home. And then, Earth will answer." The convoy had started as a mission of mercy, a journey to bring hope and healing to Haven 3. Now it was a massacre. The attackers had struck without honor, destroying ships that carried no weapons worth fearing. They thought Earth would bow its head and mourn quietly, but they had miscalculated. In those flames and screams, something far greater was born. Humanity's wrath. The cost was high, but the reckoning had just begun. Jack Turner pulled himself out from under the collapsed bulkhead, coughing through smoke and sparks. The horizon groaned around him, systems failing one by one as the ship drifted, wounded through the void. He pressed a hand against his shoulder where blood seeped through his uniform, but he ignored the pain. Around him, crew members shouted orders, dragged injured friends, and tried to seal ruptures before the vacuum claimed them. Jack staggered to the main engineering panel, his hands already flying across the controls. Half the ship was gone, but the reactor still burned strong. If he could keep it alive, then maybe they had a chance. On the other side of the ship, Dr. Claire Morgan worked in a corridor that was little more than a battlefield hospital now. Wounded men and women lay in rows on the floor, their faces pale under the flickering emergency lights. Claire's hands shook as she pressed a sealing patch over a deep chest wound, listening to the gasping breaths of a soldier who should have been safe on a medical convoy, not dying in her arms. She bit down her fear, whispering to him as she worked, "Stay with me. You're not leaving me today." Her uniform was soaked in blood that wasn't her own. The comms were a storm of voices, captains screaming for help, officers calling for evac, desperate cries from ships that would never see home again. Jack tuned most of it out as he rerouted power through bypass conduits, his fingers moving with the sharpness of instinct. The horizon lurched suddenly as another hit tore through its flank. Jack was thrown to the deck, sparks showering over him, but the reactor held. He pushed himself up, teeth clenched. "Not yet," he muttered, forcing more power into the surviving thrusters. "We're not done yet." Captain Laura Bennett stood at the bridge, her eyes hollow but fierce. The horizon had lost its escort frigate, torn apart in a blinding explosion minutes ago. Only one other freighter remained beside them, its hull leaking atmosphere, its lights dim. The rest of the convoy was gone, shattered into drifting wreckage. Laura gripped the command chair so tightly her knuckles bled. Every scream on the comms seared into her memory. She had sworn to protect the convoy, and now most of it lay dead. Yet surrender was not in her nature. "Plot a course away from the battlefield," she ordered. "Get us clear." The surviving frigate threw itself between the horizon and the enemy, shielding them with its failing armor. Its captain's final transmission came through the comms, steady and calm despite the chaos. "Keep going, Bennett. Carry the truth back to Earth." Then the frigate turned to face the swarm of attackers, guns blazing. Seconds later, it vanished in a blossom of fire. Silence followed, and Laura closed her eyes for the briefest moment before forcing herself back into command. The sacrifice would not be wasted. Claire Morgan fought against despair as more wounded were dragged in, some barely breathing, others already gone before they reached her. She shouted for supplies, for med kits, for more hands, but there was never enough. She stitched, bandaged, and prayed, her heart breaking with each life she could not save. "We'll remember you," she whispered to the still faces as she moved on to the next patient. "We'll make them pay." Jack finally managed to stabilize the engines, pushing them into overdrive. The ship shuddered as the cores screamed under the strain, but the horizon surged forward, tearing itself free from the battlefield. Laura's voice echoed through the ship's intercom. All surviving crew, brace yourselves. We're running for our lives. The stars stretched ahead as the horizon pushed into the dark, limping but alive. Behind them, the wreckage of the convoy burned like a graveyard of light. Only 3 ships had survived the massacre: the Horizon, the battered freighter beside it, and one crippled medical vessel with barely any power left. Together, they drifted into the silence of deep space, carrying with them the weight of hundreds of lost lives. The screams on the comms faded to static, and then even that was gone. What remained was the quiet fury of survivors who had seen too much to ever forget. Laura stood at the command deck, staring at the stars with eyes full of fire. Jack collapsed into his chair, exhausted but alive, while Claire Morgan pressed her bloodied hands against her knees, whispering silent promises to the dead. None of them said it aloud, but the truth burned in their hearts. The enemy had committed a crime that would not be forgiven. Humanity had been struck at its weakest, and now the survivors carried a message that would shake Earth itself. The enemy thought the story would end here, among the ruins of a convoy, but this was only the beginning. The council chamber on Earth was silent as the transmission played across every screen. Burning ships drifted in black space, voices of dying men and women crying out for help before fading into static. Doctors begging for mercy, children screaming in fear, then silence. The lights of the destroyed convoy floated like tombstones among the stars. When the recording ended, no one spoke for several long seconds. The weight of it pressed down on every heart in the room. Commander Richard Hale rose to his feet, his face carved with fury. His voice shook the chamber when he spoke. They murdered our wounded. They slaughtered healers and civilians. This was not war. This was butchery. His words echoed through the hall, drawing a sharp breath from every official present. The Earth Council did not debate, did not argue. The decision was already written in every furious expression. Humanity would answer. Within hours, orders spread across the planet and its colonies. Shipyards blazed with activity as workers labored without rest. Factories shifted into overdrive, churning out weapons, armor plating, and engine cores. Recruitment centers overflowed with volunteers, ordinary men and women who lined up in endless queues. Farmers, miners, students, engineers, everyone wanted to fight. They didn't speak of fear. They spoke of vengeance. Across the networks, images of the destroyed convoy replayed again and again. The face of Captain Laura Bennett appeared, scarred and unbroken, as she swore into the camera, "We will not forget. We will not forgive." Survivors like Jack Turner became symbols of resilience, men and women who had lived through the flames and carried the truth home. Dr. Claire Morgan, still covered in blood from the massacre, looked into the lens and whispered, "We heal, but we do not forget, and we will make them pay." Their words spread like fire, igniting the hearts of billions. Children in schools raised their fists when teachers spoke of the fallen. Workers painted the names of lost convoy ships on banners and hung them in factories. Colonists far from Earth pledged their own resources to the cause. Humanity had never been so united. The enemy thought they had struck a blow that would frighten humans into silence. Instead, they had forged something stronger, fury that burned in every corner of Earth and its colonies. Admiral Jonathan Pierce stood at the Orbital Fleet Command, his eyes scanning the growing lists of ships being assembled. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, carriers, all pulled from reserves or newly built. His hand hovered over the fleet assignments, placing names and vessels with a precision that left no room for weakness. He had commanded many battles in his lifetime, but never had he seen such resolve in his people. "They wanted war," he muttered as he reviewed the deployment orders. "Now they'll choke on it." Jack Turner, still haunted by screams from the horizon, walked among the repair bays where damaged ships returned. He refused to take leave, pouring every ounce of himself into rebuilding broken systems, patching wounded hulls, and readying vessels for the war ahead. Claire Morgan worked beside him in a different way, treating survivors of the massacre and preparing medical teams for what was coming. She saw the same fire in every soldier's eyes. The knowledge that this war was no longer about survival alone. It was about justice. On the streets of Earth's great cities, People marched together in silence at night, carrying candles in memory of the fallen. Yet, in the same breath, they cheered the sight of warships launching into orbit, their engines blazing trails of fire across the sky. Every launch shook the ground and sent a roar through the crowds. They were not just ships, they were promises of retribution. The council broadcast one final message across all channels before the first fleets departed. The chairwoman stood tall, her voice clear and unyielding. They thought we would bow our heads, they thought we would surrender, but Earth does not kneel, Earth rises. From this moment forward, we are at war, and we will not hesitate. Around the planet, in orbit and in colonies scattered across the stars, millions repeated her final words as if they were sacred. Not in fear, not in despair, but in unity, in rage, and in iron resolve. For the first time in generations, humanity was no longer divided by borders or politics. They were one people, carrying one truth. The dead of the convoy had called out, and Earth had answered. The storm was coming, and it would be unstoppable. The fleet emerged from jump space like a storm of steel and fire. Admiral Jonathan Pierce stood on the command deck of the heavy cruiser Resolute, his gaze fixed on the enemy stronghold ahead. Around him stretched the largest fleet Earth had ever sent into hostile space. Rows of destroyers, cruisers, and carriers, their engines burning bright against the darkness. The time for mourning had ended. Now came the reckoning. Among the warships sailed Captain Laura Bennett, promoted after surviving the massacre. Her new command, the cruiser Valiant, carried her into battle with a crew who looked at her not just as a captain, but as a symbol of survival. She remembered every voice that had died in the convoy, every plea cut short by static. The grief still burned, but now it was fuel. Her orders were simple: strike hard, strike fast, and leave nothing standing. On the destroyer Tempest, Jack Turner bent over glowing consoles and engineering, sweat dripping as he pushed the ship's engines to their limits. The Tempest was fresh from the shipyards, untested in war, and Jack had been brought aboard because of his reputation. He could keep even a dying ship alive. He knew his job was simple: make sure the engines never failed, no matter how fierce the battle became. Dr. Claire Morgan prepared her medical teams on the carrier Mercy. The medbay glowed with sterile lights, rows of beds ready to receive the wounded. She walked between them, checking supplies, her heart heavy with the knowledge that soon every bed would be filled. She prayed silently for the strength to keep her hands steady when the storm broke. The enemy was waiting. Warships ringed the orbit of Haven 3, feeding on the ruins of the destroyed convoy. They hadn't expected Earth to respond so quickly, and certainly not with such force. When their sensors lit up with the arrival of Pierce's fleet, their formation wavered. For a moment, hesitation hung in the void. Then Pierce gave the order that shook the stars: open fire. The void erupted. Beams of light cut across space, missiles streaked like falling stars, and the thunder of engines roared through the silence of vacuum. The Resolute's main cannons fired in measured fury, tearing through the shields of the first enemy battleship. The Valiant surged forward under Laura's command, guns blazing as it tore through enemy flanks. Jack's ship, the Tempest, darted between larger vessels, striking like a blade before retreating to safety. Inside the Mercy, the first wave of wounded poured in. Claire worked with blood already staining her gloves, calling for plasma packs, stabilizers, and med drones as soldiers screamed in agony around her. She blocked out the chaos, forcing herself to focus on one patient at a time. Outside her walls, men and women fought and died, and she was their last hope. The battle raged without mercy. Enemy warships broke under the sheer weight of Earth's fury, but every victory came at a cost. 2 destroyers vanished in fire, their crews gone in an instant. Laura's Valiant took a direct hit that burned across its side, but she refused to fall back. "Press forward," she shouted, eyes locked on the enemy flagship. "They will break before we do." Hours passed like moments, and the void became a graveyard of burning hulks. At last, the Resolute unleashed its main weapon in a single devastating blast, cutting the enemy flagship clean in half. The shock rippled through the hostile fleet, and their formations collapsed. What remained of them fled into the shadows, leaving wreckage and silence behind. On the bridge of the Resolute, Admiral Pierce stood unflinching as reports came in. Too many ships lost, too many dead. Yet the enemy was broken, their arrogance shattered. For the first time, Earth had struck back and struck hard. Laura Bennett leaned against her command chair, her body aching, her voice hoarse, but her spirit burning brighter than ever. Jack Turner collapsed against the console, exhausted but alive, having kept the Tempest's heart beating when it should have failed. Claire Morgan dropped her gloves, her hands shaking after hours of work, surrounded by rows of the wounded she had saved, and the silent stillness of those she had not. The Battle of Haven 3 was over, but its echoes would spread across the stars. Humanity had proved that when its people were attacked, it did not cower. It answered with fire, and this was only the beginning. Wreckage drifted in the orbit of Haven 3, a broken crown of twisted metal and shattered hulls. Fires still burned on fragments of ships, their light casting a dim glow over the battlefield. The silence that followed was not peace, but the heavy breath of survival. The Earth fleet held position among the ruins, battered yet unbroken. Every ship bore scars. Some limped with one engine, some bled air from torn hulls, yet they stood together, proving that humanity had endured the storm. On the deck of the Valiant, Captain Laura Bennett refused to rest. Her uniform was scorched, her body aching from hours of command, but her eyes stayed sharp. She walked the bridge, studying damage reports, issuing orders to patch systems, refusing to let her crew see her falter. They called her Iron Captain in whispers now, the one who would not break even when the world around her burned. She carried that weight with pride, though she knew the price it demanded. Jack Turner sat slumped against a wall in the engineering bay of the Tempest, his face streaked with sweat and soot. He had driven the engines far beyond their limits, coaxing life out of systems that should have collapsed hours earlier. His crew looked at him with awe, whispering that he could hear the ship breathe, that he refused to let it die. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought only of the voices that had been lost in the convoy and how he would make sure no ship under his hands met the same fate. Dr. Claire Morgan finally stepped back from the rows of wounded aboard the Mercy. Her hands trembled as she removed her gloves, stained with blood and burned skin. She had worked without pause, sealing wounds, replacing blood, restarting failing hearts. Some she saved, many she did not. She whispered silent promises to the still faces that she would carry their names with her. Around her, nurses moved quietly, their exhaustion hidden behind steady determination. Claire forced herself to keep standing because she knew the war had only begun. Admiral Jonathan Pierce stood at the command table aboard the Resolute, his voice quiet but firm as he spoke to his officers. "We won the field," he said, "but this is not victory. This is warning. The enemy will return. They always return." His gaze fell across the battle map, glowing with shifting symbols of enemy fleets. "And when they come, we will meet them again. Stronger, harder, until nothing of their arrogance remains." The survivors gathered what they could from the wreckage. Escape pods were recovered, shattered hulls searched for survivors, fragments of data pulled from ruined computers. Every piece of wreckage told a story of sacrifice, crews who fought until their last breath to give Earth a chance. Their names would not be forgotten. Back on Earth, the news of Haven 3 spread like wildfire. Images of burning warships and triumphant survivors filled every screen. Crowds filled the streets, chanting the names of their heroes. Laura Bennett, Jack Turner, Claire Morgan, Jonathan Pierce. These names became banners of defiance, symbols that humanity was no longer prey, but a force to be reckoned with. Children painted their names on walls. Workers etched them into steel plates destined for new ships. Hope was born from the ashes. Among the ruins of Haven 3's orbit, the fleet lit memorial beacons. One by one, ships powered up their signal lights, bright white beacons shining into the darkness. They formed a constellation of remembrance, each light standing for a ship, a crew, a life lost. The void filled with silent fire, a promise that their deaths would not be meaningless. Crews stood at attention on every deck, saluting the lights, their voices united in a vow that the enemy would pay. Jack Turner looked out from a cracked viewport, the glow of the beacons reflecting in his tired eyes. Claire Morgan stood beside him, her face pale but steady, whispering the names of her lost patients under her breath. Laura Bennett stood alone on the bridge of her ship, her voice low as she swore to herself that she would never allow another massacre to pass unanswered. The Battle of Haven 3 was written into history that day. not as an ending, but as a beginning. The ruins were graves, yes, but they were also seeds. From them, humanity's fury would grow, and its fleets would rise stronger than before. Haven 3 was a scar. Haven 3 was a warning. And above all, Haven 3 was a promise that Earth would never bow again. The enemy believed humans would retreat into silence, that grief would chain them, that fear would scatter their fleets. Instead, Earth answered with fire. From the shipyards of Mars to the orbital docks above the moon, new warships rolled out in endless lines. Destroyers painted with fresh steel, cruisers armed with weapons more powerful than before, carriers stocked with fighters ready to strike. The air of the factories thundered with hammers and welders as men and women worked night and day, driven not by orders but by vengeance. Humanity had turned its sorrow into steel. Captain Laura Bennett drilled her crew until exhaustion became routine. On the Valiant, no one was allowed to forget the dead of Haven 3. Every new recruit was shown the footage of the convoy's destruction before stepping onto the bridge. Laura did not let them look away. "This is why we fight," she told them, her voice iron. "If you want peace, earn it in fire." Her ship became sharper, faster, more unyielding with every day that passed. Her name spread among the stars like a warning. Jack Turner became a legend among engineers. In every fleet, captains asked for him by name, knowing he could keep a crippled engine alive longer than anyone else. He worked with grease-stained hands, crawling through broken hulls while battles raged outside. When others gave up on ships that should have been lost, Jack dragged them back to life. Crews whispered that he could hear the heartbeat of machines, that no ship under his care would go quietly. He laughed at the stories, but deep inside he carried the truth. He fought through engines because it was the only way he knew to fight for the dead. Dr. Claire Morgan traveled with the Mercy wherever the fleet went. To soldiers, her face became a symbol of survival, a light in the storm. Broadcasts of her work spread across colonies, her hands covered in blood, her eyes burning with determination as she refused to let another soldier die. Colonists sent her messages of thanks, calling her the guardian of humanity's wounded. Claire never considered herself a symbol. She only saw the next patient, the next bleeding wound, the next broken body she could save. Yet, even she could not deny the fire that grew in her with each life the enemy tried to take. The enemy launched raids on border colonies, testing Earth's resolve. They expected weakness, but each time Earth's fleets responded harder, faster, deadlier. In one raid, enemy cruisers struck a mining world, certain they would escape with spoils. Instead, Laura's Valiant and her battle group dropped out of jump space with guns already blazing, tearing the raiders apart before they could flee. Survivors whispered her name like a curse, and the enemy began to fear the very shadow of human ships. Jack was there too, repairing the Tempest mid-battle while fire tore across its hull. He ripped open panels, sparks flying into his face, and rewired power lines by hand as the ship shook under cannon fire. "Not today," he muttered through clenched teeth, forcing life back into the engines until the destroyer roared again, returning to the fight with vengeance. The Tempest survived, and Jack's legend grew. Claire's medbay overflowed after every battle, but she refused to leave the front lines. When asked why she didn't return to safer postings on Earth, she answered simply, "If they bleed here, then I stand here." Soldiers who woke to see her face swore to fight harder, knowing that if they fell, someone would not abandon them. Her presence became as vital as any weapon. Admiral Pierce watched the transformation of humanity's fleets with pride. He had seen Earth fight before, but never like this. Every skirmish became a lesson, every loss a reason to strike harder. The enemy had wanted submission. Instead, they had forged a people who fought with the fire of survival and the steel of vengeance. What had begun as defense turned into something greater. Humanity was no longer reacting, no longer only shielding its worlds. Now its fleets hunted. Now its captains struck first. Now the enemy felt the terror of human vengeance at their own doors. Earth had been wounded, yes, but Earth had learned, and in learning, Earth had become unstoppable. The greatest fleet humanity had ever assembled gathered in the red skies above Mars. Hundreds of warships floated in precise formation, their hulls gleaming under the glow of the planet below. Carriers heavy with fighters, cruisers bristling with cannons, destroyers sleek and fast, all stood ready for war. The silence between them was alive with tension, the calm before a storm that would decide the fate of two civilizations. Admiral Jonathan Pierce walked the deck of the Resolute, his gaze locked on the endless rows of ships under his command. Years of battle had hardened him, but even he felt the weight of this moment. His orders were not just to strike, his orders were to bring the war into the enemy's heart, to shatter their confidence, and to show them the true cost of attacking Earth. Captain Laura Bennett stood at the center of her bridge aboard the Valiant. Her crew called her the Iron Captain, but she carried more than steel in her heart. She carried every face lost in the convoy, every soldier buried in the void. Now she commanded an entire battle group, dozens of ships answering to her voice. She did not smile, she did not tremble. She only whispered to herself before the jump, "This is for them." Jack Turner was already on his knees in the Tempest's engine room, tools in hand, upgrading the cores he had rebuilt 100 times before. He had pushed these machines further than anyone believed possible, but now he pushed them again, squeezing more speed, more power, more life out of the ship. The crew trusted him with their survival, and he would not fail them. "She'll hold," he muttered, wiping grease from his hands as alarms signaled final preparations. "I'll make her hold." On the Mercy, Dr. Claire Morgan inspected her medical teams one last time. Rows of stretchers stood ready, cabinets filled with surgical kits and stasis units. She knew what awaited them, hours of blood, screams, and loss, but her voice was calm as she told her team, "Every life you save today is another blow against the enemy. Don't forget that." Her presence steadied them. If Claire could stand in the storm, so could they. The jump order came. The stars bent and tore as the fleet plunged into the enemy's heartland. When the void snapped back into focus, the enemy shipyards stretched before them, massive rings and stations orbiting a gas giant, swarming with their warships. Factories glowed with heat, birthing vessels meant to destroy humanity. It was the core of their power, and Earth had come to burn it. "Attack!" Admiral Pierce's voice thundered across the fleet. At once, Earth's warships surged forward. Missiles streaked across the void. Beams of light carved through enemy lines. The Valiant cut into the flank of a heavy cruiser, Laura commanding every move with ruthless precision. The Tempest darted through gaps like a blade, engines screaming under Jack's control as it unleashed volleys on vulnerable targets. The Mercy stood just behind the lines, already pulling in the first wave of wounded, as Claire and her team leapt into action. The enemy threw everything they had at the humans. Battleships rose from the shipyards, fighters swarmed in clouds, orbital defenses fired torrents of plasma. The void became a maelstrom of fire and death. But Earth did not break. Ship by ship, formation by formation, humanity tore through the defenses. Jack kept the Tempest alive as if it were a living creature, dragging her back from the edge again and again. Laura's voice cut through the chaos, guiding her battle group like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. Claire's hands never stopped moving, her medbay filled with the wounded who clung to her voice as she urged them to hold on. At last, the Resolute's cannons turned on the enemy's central shipyard. With one devastating blast, the massive ring split apart, its sections breaking into fire and debris. The explosion lit the void like a new sun, shaking the enemy's courage to its core. One by one, their formations broke, retreating into the darkness. Admiral Pierce stood tall as the flames spread across the wreckage. His voice was low but firm. "Let them run. Let them know Earth walks their skies now." Laura Bennett stared at the burning ruins on her screen, her eyes hard. Jack collapsed onto the deck of engineering, exhausted but alive, while Claire Morgan pulled her gloves off, whispering to herself as she looked at the faces she had saved. Humanity had struck the heart of the enemy and left it in ashes. The war was far from over, but the balance had shifted. The enemy finally understood what it meant to provoke Earth. They had thought humans fragile. Instead, they had awakened a storm. The war no longer belonged to the enemy. What began with the slaughter of a single convoy had transformed into a fire that spread across the stars, and now that fire carried Earth's name. Humanity no longer defended its borders. It carved deep into hostile space, tearing down fortresses, shipyards, and colonies that had once stood untouchable. The message was clear in every battle, in every burning wreck left behind. Earth had no hesitation. Captain Laura Bennett led her battle group like a blade through the dark, her valiant at the front of every charge. She had become more than a captain, she was a legend whispered by both allies and enemies. Her crew followed her without question, knowing she would never flinch, never yield, never turn from the fight. Her voice became the anthem of Earth's fleets. Hold the line. Strike hard. Remember the convoy. Jack Turner lived in the heart of engines, his hands black with oil and burns from endless battles. He no longer waited for ships to break. He rebuilt them faster than they could be destroyed, dragging crippled vessels back into the fight within hours. Crews across the fleet began calling him the Soul of Steel, the man who gave ships a second life when all seemed lost. To Jack, it wasn't about titles. It was about making sure no ship died the way the Horizon almost had. Dr. Claire Morgan stood in blood and smoke, her eyes fierce behind her exhaustion. Her medbay became the heart of courage for the fleet, where soldiers who thought they were finished found themselves alive again. She stitched wounds, rebuilt shattered bones, pulled men and women back from death's edge. In her quiet moments, she whispered to herself that she fought not with weapons, but with every life she refused to let the enemy take. Her work became a war of its own, one fought against despair. Admiral Jonathan Pierce watched the fleets expand beyond anything Earth had ever dreamed. Hundreds of ships now carried humanity's fury into enemy space, and behind them followed more, new hulls rolling out of shipyards every week. His eyes burned with pride as he looked at the charts that marked enemy worlds lost one by one. Where once the enemy had thought Earth would tremble, now they trembled instead. On Earth, people no longer marched with candles alone. They marched with banners of steel. Children in schools learned the names of the fallen and the living heroes alike. Colonists far beyond the core worlds carved humanity's oath into their walls. Earth protects its own. The war had become more than revenge. It was survival, pride, and the undeniable truth that humanity would never bow again. The enemy, once so confident, now fought desperately to hold their ground. They had underestimated the one thing no calculation could measure, the human will to endure. They had believed humans fragile, but fragility had become fury. They had struck at mercy ships, and in return, Earth unleashed fleets that burned across galaxies. Laura Bennett's Valiant, Jack Turner's Tempest, Claire Morgan's Mercy, and Pierce's Resolute stood as symbols of that truth. They carried forward the memory of Haven 3, never allowing the galaxy to forget the day humanity was forced into war. Every blast, every victory, every sacrifice carried the same silent vow, never again. The war did not end in silence, but in fire, and in that fire, humanity's voice thundered across the stars. It was not the voice of conquerors, but of survivors who refused to be broken. They had been tested, they had bled, they had mourned, but they had risen stronger than any enemy expected. And from that moment on, no power in the galaxy would ever doubt again that when Earth was struck, it would rise, and it would strike back without hesitation.